Welcome to my channel, The Good Book Tales. In today's video, we dive into one of the most powerful and emotional journeys in the Bible, the story of the prophet Jeremiah. His life is not just a tale from ancient history, but a living reminder of courage, faith, and heartbreak. But Jeremiah's story is not like most prophets we read about. His voice was lonely, his mission was painful, and his message was one that few wanted to hear. And yet, his story has survived for thousands of years, echoing across generations with a warning, a hope, and a promise that still speaks today. Imagine being called by God at a young age, chosen to be a prophet not in times of peace and celebration, but in days of darkness, rebellion, and looming destruction. This is where Jeremiah's journey begins. A young man from a small town, suddenly given a mission bigger than himself. A mission that would make him a target of anger, betrayal, and rejection from his own people. He was told to speak the truth no matter the cost, even if it meant standing alone. The story of Jeremiah is not only about prophecy, it's about a human being wrestling with doubt, fear, and the weight of an impossible task. The world around Jeremiah was crumbling. The kingdom of Judah was filled with corruption, false prophets, and leaders who had turned their hearts away from God. While others shouted peace and prosperity, Jeremiah carried a different message, a warning of judgment, exile, and destruction if the people did not turn back to the truth. But who would want to listen to such a message? Who would believe a young prophet when all the voices around them promised comfort? As we move through his story, we see Jeremiah not just as a prophet, but as a man torn between obedience and despair. He was called the weeping prophet because his heart broke for the people he loved, even as they mocked him, imprisoned him, and tried to silence him. In many ways, Jeremiah's struggle feels deeply human. He questioned his calling, he poured out his frustration in prayer, and he often wondered why his life was filled with so much suffering. And yet, through it all, he never gave up. His words became like fire in his bones, something he could not keep silent. The story of the prophet Jeremiah is filled with visions, warnings, and raw honesty. It is a story of a man who stood firm in the face of kings, priests, and crowds who hated him for speaking the truth. It is a story of courage in the middle of despair, of tears mixed with hope, and of promises that would outlast empires. And as we uncover his journey, we are left with one haunting question. When everything around us is collapsing, will we stand for truth, even if it costs us everything? And this is just the beginning. In the next part, we'll step into the very moment when Jeremiah hears the voice of God for the first time. A moment that changes the course of his life forever. But what exactly did God say to this young man? And why did those words bring both comfort and fear? That's where the real story begins. When Jeremiah first heard the voice of God, he was still just a young man, living quietly in the small town of Anathoth. He was not a warrior, not a priest from a powerful family, not even someone people would expect to become a prophet. He was ordinary, someone you might overlook in a crowd. Yet this was the very person God chose to carry a message that would shake nations. And that is where the mystery deepens. Why Jeremiah? Why would God place such a heavy burden on someone so young, someone who felt so unprepared? In that first encounter, God spoke words that would shape the rest of Jeremiah's life. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. Imagine hearing those words for the first time. Imagine realizing that your entire life, every step and every breath, had been leading you to this exact moment. Jeremiah tried to protest. He said he was too young, too unready, too weak. But God answered him firmly, saying he would give Jeremiah the words to speak, and no one would be able to silence him. This calling was not something Jeremiah could run from. even though every part of him wanted to. The world around Jeremiah was not a safe place for truth-tellers. The kingdom of Judah was outwardly religious, but inwardly corrupt. The people went to the temple, offered sacrifices, and spoke about God, but their hearts were far from Him. Idols stood in the very streets of Jerusalem, and the cries of injustice filled the land. Leaders grew fat on dishonesty. Priests turned blind eyes, and prophets promised blessings while hiding the truth. Against this backdrop, Jeremiah was commanded to speak, not gentle words of peace, but warnings of fire, destruction, and exile. For Jeremiah, this was not just about standing against strangers. It was about confronting his own neighbors, his friends, even his family. The same people he grew up with would soon despise him for the message he carried. His voice would not bring applause, but scorn, not honor, but shame. And yet, there was no turning back. The story of the prophet Jeremiah is not only about divine visions, it is about the weight of loneliness, the pain of rejection, and the courage to keep going when everyone else walks away. Each word he spoke brought him closer to danger, but it also drew him deeper into the purpose for which he had been born. The question hanging in the air is this: how long can one man stand against the tide of an entire nation, armed with nothing but the word of God burning in his heart? And as Jeremiah begins to step into his calling, the storm around him is only starting to rise. From the very start, Jeremiah's greatest conflict was not only with the powerful kings and priests of Judah, but with his own heart. He loved his people deeply. He wanted nothing more than to see them safe, blessed, and at peace. Yet the words God gave him to speak were the exact opposite of what everyone wanted to hear. The other prophets filled the air with promises of prosperity and protection, assuring the people that Jerusalem would never fall. Jeremiah, on the other hand, carried a message of judgment, that the city would be destroyed, that exile was coming, and that no wall or temple could protect them from what was about to happen. This set the stage for a clash not just between Jeremiah and the leaders of Judah, but between truth and deception. Imagine the pressure he felt when every voice around him shouted comfort, while his own voice delivered warning. The crowds would gather, and Jeremiah would stand alone, telling them that their false worship and injustice would bring disaster. Some laughed at him, others grew angry, and many simply ignored him. To them, Jeremiah was a nuisance, a man spreading fear where they wanted hope. The conflict grew heavier as Jeremiah found opposition, even in unexpected places. His own relatives from Anathoth plotted against him, hoping to silence him once and for all. The priests and prophets in the temple accused him of treason, calling him dangerous to the nation. And yet, despite their hatred, Jeremiah could not stop. The word of God burned within him like fire, and to hold it back felt impossible. But as the walls of resistance closed in, the question remained: how long could one man carry such a burden, standing alone against the powerful voices of his day? The answer was far from clear, and the danger was only beginning. The pressure on Jeremiah only grew heavier as the days passed. His warnings became louder, his visions darker, and the rejection more fierce. In the streets of Jerusalem, the people carried on with their celebrations, trading in the markets and worshipping idols, while Jeremiah stood in the gates crying out that destruction was near. His voice echoed against stone walls, but hearts remained hardened. The leaders mocked him, asking how a single man could know more than the priests, the prophets, and the king himself. Each word Jeremiah spoke pulled him further away from safety and closer to the edge of danger. Then came the moment that set everything on fire. Jeremiah was commanded to stand in the very heart of the temple, the sacred place everyone believed untouchable, and speak words that no one wanted to hear. He declared that unless the people turned back, the temple would be destroyed just like Shiloh, and the city itself would fall into ruin. These words pierced like knives. The crowd erupted with rage. Priests shouted for his death. Prophets accused him of blasphemy. And the people, once his neighbors, now demanded his blood. Jeremiah stood alone, surrounded by enemies, with no protection but the message he had been given. Behind the anger of the people was a greater storm. Foreign armies were gathering on the horizon. Whispers of Babylon filled the air, the shadow of exile creeping closer with every day. Jeremiah's words no longer sounded like distant warnings. They were beginning to match the reality unfolding before their eyes. Yet instead of repenting, the leaders tightened their grip on lies, promising peace when war was already at the gates. The tension reached its breaking point. Jeremiah's life hung by a thread, and the fate of an entire nation trembled with it. Just when it seemed Jeremiah's voice would finally be silenced, another twist shook the story even deeper. The prophet was dragged before the rulers, accused of treason, and many shouted for his execution. To stand against the temple, against the city, and against the king was seen as betrayal of everything sacred. Yet, in an unexpected turn, some elders rose up to defend him. They remembered the story of the prophet Micah, who also warned of destruction in the days of King Hezekiah. Instead of killing Micah, the king had listened, and disaster was delayed. Their memory of that old story saved Jeremiah's life, but not his freedom. Instead of being executed, he was thrown into prison, locked away like a criminal, while his warnings went on unheeded. But captivity only made the message burn stronger. Even behind bars, Jeremiah declared that Babylon was coming, that the city of Jerusalem would be handed over, and that the people would be carried into exile. To the rulers, this was unbearable. How could a prophet of Judah speak against his own nation in its darkest hour? To them, Jeremiah was not only a nuisance, but a threat to morale, a voice that weakened the courage of the soldiers. So they tried to silence him once again, this time in a way that would surely end his life. In secret, Jeremiah was lowered into a cistern, a dark, muddy pit where there was no water, only sludge. The plan was cruel and simple. Let him sink into the mud, forgotten, until he starved. Alone in the darkness, Jeremiah's cries echoed off the stone walls. It seemed as though this was the end, the final silence of the weeping prophet. Yet even in that pit, his message still lived, carried in whispers through the streets. What made this moment even more shocking was who came to his aid. It was not a king or priest, not even a fellow prophet, but an unlikely foreigner, Ebed-Melech, an Ethiopian servant in the palace. Risking his own life, he pleaded with the king to rescue Jeremiah from the pit. With torn cloths and ropes, Jeremiah was lifted from the mud, his body bruised, but his spirit unbroken. The stakes had now risen higher than ever. Jeremiah was alive, but the leaders were growing desperate. Babylon was drawing closer, and the prophet's voice was louder than ever. The nation stood on the edge of collapse, and the next choice would determine whether they survived or fell into ruin. The moment finally came when all of Jeremiah's warnings unfolded before the eyes of the people. Babylon's armies swept across the land, their banners casting long shadows over Judah. The sound of siege engines thundered against the walls of Jerusalem, and the once crowded markets fell silent with fear. For years, Jeremiah had cried out that this day was coming, and now there was no escape. Hunger filled the city, families whispered in despair, and the king himself trembled in his palace, caught between rebellion and surrender. The climax of Jeremiah's story was not only about prophecy fulfilled, but about the raw collapse of a nation that refused to listen. King Zedekiah, desperate and torn, secretly called for Jeremiah one last time. He hoped the prophet would speak a word of mercy, some hidden promise that the city would be spared. But Jeremiah's message did not change. He told the king that if he surrendered to Babylon, his life would be spared, and the city would not be burned. If he resisted, everything would be destroyed. It was the final choice, a moment of truth standing between survival and ruin. Yet fear gripped the king's heart more tightly than faith. Zedekiah could not bring himself to surrender. His hesitation sealed the fate of Jerusalem. The Babylonians broke through the walls. Fire consumed the temple, the symbol of God's presence among the people. The palace collapsed into ash, and the city that once echoed with songs of worship was left in ruins. The people were taken into exile, chained and scattered far from their homeland. Everything Jeremiah had warned about came true with devastating clarity. His tears became reality, his words carved into history by fire and sword. But just when it seemed Jeremiah's story would end in despair, the unexpected twist came. While kings, priests, and soldiers were carried away in chains, Jeremiah was spared. By the command of the Babylonian ruler himself, the prophet was released, treated with respect, and given freedom in the land. The man who had been mocked, beaten, and imprisoned was now the one left standing among the ruins, his voice vindicated, though his heart remained broken. The climax of Jeremiah's life was both victory and sorrow. He lived to see his words fulfilled, yet he stood alone in a shattered city, holding the truth that no one had wanted to believe. And even here, with destruction all around, the story was not finished. For in the ashes of judgment, Jeremiah carried a hidden promise, a message of hope that pointed to a future beyond exile. As the smoke rose from the ruins of Jerusalem, Jeremiah walked among the broken stones, his heart heavy with grief. Everything he loved had fallen, just as God had shown him it would. Yet in the silence of the destroyed city, Jeremiah began to speak a new message. It was not only about judgment anymore, it was about hope. Even in the ashes, God had not abandoned his people. Jeremiah declared that after 70 years in Babylon, the exiles would return, and the covenant between God and his people would be renewed. The same prophet who was known for weeping also became the prophet of hope, carrying a promise that destruction would not have the final word. For the people of Judah, this message became a lifeline. Though scattered and broken, they clung to the vision that one day their children and grandchildren would come home. Jeremiah's words of exile and return echoed across generations, reminding them that God's plans were not for endless ruin, but for restoration. He spoke of a new covenant, one that would not be written on tablets of stone or housed in a temple, but written on human hearts. This was the deepest truth Jeremiah carried, that even when the outward world falls apart, the bond between God and his people can never be completely destroyed. Looking back at his journey, we see a man who endured loneliness, betrayal, and pain, yet never let go of the mission given to him. The priests who mocked him, the kings who ignored him, the people who turned against him, all their voices faded, while Jeremiah's words endured. His story teaches us that truth is not always welcomed, but it is always powerful. Sometimes it means standing alone, sometimes it means suffering, but in the end, truth stands when everything else crumbles. The story of the prophet Jeremiah is not just an ancient tale locked in the pages of the Bible. It is a story about courage in the face of rejection, about holding on to faith when the world around us falls apart, and about the hope that rises from ruins. His life reminds us that even in our darkest moments, there is always a promise waiting beyond the pain. Jeremiah's voice still calls across time, asking us the same question his people once faced. Will we listen before it's too late? And so, the weeping prophet's story closes not with despair, but with hope, a hope that still shines today.